and I interviewed some women who'd been caught up in the violence a little bit later. This is mid-June 2008, speaking to women from Harare. I went to a clinic in central Harare to meet 3 women from Epworth who had been raped and beaten. One was too broken by her experience to talk. She lay silently in her bed, her eyes darting nervously around the room, the covers pulled up to her neck. But the other 2 victims, Lisa and Yvonne, were eager to tell their story. "They came to my house on 8th of June, said Lisa. "They said I was an MDC supporter. I was wearing my party t-shirt and I was about to go to a rally. They burned down my house and took all my things. I ran away and hid, but the next day they came back to rape me. I knew some of them as local ZANU-PF members. They took me to a graveyard and raped me again. When I was trying to stop them, they took a hot wire and burned my hand. They looted my body like I was dead. They took my ID card and all my money." Yvonne's experience was similar, but her assault was more sustained. "They came to my place at 8 p.m. on 9th of June. I was with my baby. They told me to surrender all my MDC regalia and cards. They took me to their base. One guy raped me on the way. They poured cold water on me all night, so I was freezing. They beat me over and over again with rods. They beat my genitals, my legs, back, buttocks and head. They called me names. They said I was a dog because I supported Shvangarai." When I spoke to the women, they were still in pain and coming to terms with new hardships. They returned to Epworth after being attacked to find their homes had been destroyed. They were also confronting the possibility of infection. A quarter of young men carry HIV, so the consequences of rape are potentially lethal. The women, who were all confident of their negative status prior to the attack, were dreading their test results. Lisa was angry. "I am stressed, especially about the rape. I've contracted an STD already from the rape, and now I must wait to know about HIV. I wish God would take them all. Mugabe is a pig. I wish he would die." Yvonne was more afraid. "I am stressed because I have 2 children. They poisoned my husband, and he's in the ground since 2006. Maybe I am HIV positive now because of these guys. Who will look after my children if I get AIDS? To be raped is like death." I think you know what followed those horrible incidents of violence, that the MDC reached a point where they couldn't contest the election anymore and they withdrew, and Mugabe got his victory. A lot of people often ask me if there was any way that the MDC could perhaps have fought on, could have carried on and won that election. And the only answer I can give is the small taste of what I felt of the fear of what it was like to live in Zimbabwe at that time. I'll read you this story. I don't often read this story out, but you're kind of a special group, so I'll read this one out because I think you might understand. This is about a trip I made to Manicaland in June 2008, just before the MDC pulled out. It was a horrendous trip. I saw refugee camps full of people running from burned out villages in Nyanga right across Manicaland. I saw clinics where people were lined up on the lawn in dozens, waiting for their injuries to be tended to. And on the way back to Harare from Mutare, I stopped at Rusape. I don't know if any of you know it, but I stopped at Rusape to visit the prison, because Eric Matanenga, who is now the Constitution Minister, Eric Matanenga was being held in prison there because he was an MDC member. And I was going to try and visit him. Unfortunately, when I pulled up in front of the prison, a ZANU militia came in just behind me and blocked me in, and gave me quite a hard time. And I'll read to you a bit about what that was like. In practice, only 2 of the men engaged with me. The first, whom I shall always think of as Mr. Nasty, was in his 30s, with a thick, roughly trimmed beard. He wore his ZANU t-shirt with jeans. He demanded to know who I was, what I was doing. He demanded all my papers. At first, I tried to be self-assured. I told Mr. Nasty that I would happily give my documents to any uniformed officer, but that I did not know who he was, and so I wouldn't give him my papers. He stared at me with an intense hatred. "You are a very stupid boy. Now I need to get my gun." He moved off to his pickup. I felt a sudden teary panic that I managed to keep a lid on. Mr. Nice now appeared, a smart man in a suit and tie. He appeared to argue with his colleague, then came over to see me. "You have really upset my friend, which is not very clever. But let's try to start again." The classic interrogation routine worked perfectly. I was relieved to talk to a courteous, smart, soft-spoken man after Mr. Nasty's threat. Although I had no idea who Mr. Nice was, I gave him my ID card and other documents. He asked me politely what I was doing. I told him I was election monitoring. "Let me check what we have to do on the radio." And Mr. Nice walked off, allowing Mr. Nasty to come back at me. He probably spent no more than 20 minutes working on me, but it felt like hours. Mr. Nasty said he had spoken to the prison guards and found that I had come to see Matinenga. This was a serious abuse. Matinenga was responsible for murdering hundreds of ZANU-PF people. I was helping him. Zimbabwe was not my country, but I was interfering, acting like I ruled, trying to reverse the gains of the Liberation War, trying to enslave Africans again, give land that was liberated back to whites. I hated blacks. I was a racist, an arrogant colonial racist, and a very stupid boy. He suddenly stopped. His eyes shifted about as he considered what to do. "You are not getting out of insulting our country like this. Give me your car keys." I was so scared now that my brain moved like a reptile's. Obviously, the allegation that Matinenga was a murderer was ludicrous, as was the accusation that I was helping him. But this was not a court of law. I tried to imagine what I would do if Mr. Nasty did produce a gun. Would I give him my keys, get out of the car, abandon the illusion of safety the vehicle's metal skin gave me? But I had no idea what to do, no plan, no protocol to follow. I really wanted to cry, to say sorry, to beg these men just to let me leave. I stammered out that my embassy had told me not to give away my car keys. Mr. Nasty looked at me the way a predator looks at a sick animal. This time I really need to get my gun. I was so relieved when Mr. Nice came back at that point, but I had to work hard to hold back my tears. He said that I'd broken the rules by coming to Resape and trying to see a criminal. That was not part of the work of an election monitor. Finally, Mr. Nice said I could go, but it was his parting warning that chilled me most of all. "You are just not safe here, particularly when you break the rules as you have done. We just can't guarantee that you won't be shot. You should stay in your embassy in Harare from now on." I drove off. I found it hard not to accelerate wildly down the dirt track. When I was back on the main road, I did drive much too fast for half an hour until I could persuade myself to slow down. I felt unmanned and useless, ashamed that I'd been so scared, ashamed to be so precious as to make a fuss about the nothing that had happened to me, when so many people were suffering actual pain and misery. But I did feel my own tiny share of Zimbabwe's fear. Fear of the night coming and the militias driving in, banging their weapons against car doors. The fear of being dragged off to a re-education centre for a night of agony. The fear of not knowing whether friends and family were safe. I tried to multiply what I felt by 100. I could not, but I knew as I tried that Robert Mugabe was going to win his election. Nobody could face this terror down. So after Mugabe did win his election, I think, as you know, the economy finally collapsed entirely, public services fell away, doctors stopped attending hospital, and crucially the water treatment system failed. Zimbabwe had always enjoyed excellent water, as you know. You could drink Harare's tap water when I first arrived. It was very good. But that all failed, and as a result of it failing, there was an epidemic of diseases which Zimbabwe had never experienced. I mean, when had Zimbabwe ever known a cholera outbreak? I mean, it was ludicrous for such a sophisticated country. But there was a cholera epidemic following the collapse of all public services. And I'll read you a little bit about what it was like to be there. The epidemic exploded at the beginning of the wet season in November. Zimbabwe's rains are not showers, but tropical monsoons, biblical deluges. The large quantities of human waste, filth and contamination lying in pits and on waste ground in November 2008 were washed down Harare streets where children played, flooded over the vegetables being cultivated in urban back gardens, and flowed into drains where they soon entered circulation. The failed water treatment system was no longer able to remove bacterial contaminants from wastewater. So whatever infections were washed down Harare's drains soon emerged from its taps. The number of new cases of cholera leaped rapidly, from dozens to thousands per week. People started to die. The authorities set up isolation centres for the infected, but it quickly became clear that these centres were intended to isolate news of the epidemic from the outside world, rather than to provide any quarantine. I visited a cholera ward in Mbare, a densely populated suburb of Harare, with a brave and brilliant young civil society activist. We dressed smartly, parked at some distance from the hospital, and entered through a hole in the fence, avoiding the security guards at the main gate. We headed straight for the cholera ward, only to find that all the beds in the hospital had been dedicated to victims of the disease. The nurse looked at me suspiciously and told us that no observers were allowed. But we tried a bold bluff, saying that we were both related to one of the patients. Perhaps it was the effect of our smart dress or our confident manner, but she accepted this patently untrue story, and we made our way onto the ward. Row upon row of patients lay on beds or crouched uncomfortably near buckets. Some were unnaturally still. Some groaned and clutched their bellies. Porters and nurses, masked and wrapped in plastic, moved through, removing buckets of waste and mopping vomit off the floor. My activist friend stopped by one of the beds on which a man was sitting, looking relatively healthy. The patient was ready to tell his story. He had felt ill that morning and had been lucky because his family had brought him straight to the clinic. Many sufferers in his area were too sick to travel by the time they realised what disease they had. Suddenly the man sat up alertly, looking shocked. My friend pulled me backwards just as the eruption of watery vomit struck the floor where I had been standing. I'll leave it there. I've been speaking for almost half an hour, which is far too long. You've done very well to stay awake, so congratulations on that. I'll finish off just with one very short passage, which talks about, again, this is rather personal, I'm afraid, but I feel it's a time to share this kind of material, which talks about how I felt to be leaving Zimbabwe, which, as I think many of you know, is a heartbreaking moment. As I've moved from Zimbabwe to Turkey, where I am now what the Foreign Office tactfully terms a trailing spouse, I've seen obvious differences. Having again such everyday things as water, electricity and a telephone, let alone a supermarket and broadband, is welcome. I just have to get out of the habit of buying things in huge quantities on the assumption that they won't be around tomorrow. That's actually true. The first time I went shopping in Ankara, I bought 64 toilet rolls. I just couldn't believe I would go back to the shop again tomorrow and they would all still be there. It was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But I've also come to realise how much tension and unhappiness I absorbed while in Zimbabwe. It is wonderful to be around people who have no fear, who say what they think, and who are planning for long lives. I look back on so many Zimbabwean memories, but begin to understand that I ingested the country's sadness too. My feelings turn out to be a set of paradoxes. Zimbabwe feels safe, though there is no respect for the rule of law. It is a peaceful country, but when violence breaks out, it is savage and ruthless. It is a beautiful place, with areas of hideous ugliness. Zimbabweans are so brave, but can be such cowards too. There's incredible freedom in Zimbabwe, but civil liberties are denied. The land is rich and the rainfall is heavy, but nobody gets enough to eat. It is a society of the highest standards, but so many have slipped. People are highly educated, but schools are failing. It has been a great country, but so much that was good has passed away. I love Zimbabwe, but hate it too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip, for a touching story about Zimbabwe. I think we've got all the insight, somewhat visualizing what they would think was happening when I was reading about this book. We want to thank you very, very much. Yes, thank you very much, Philip. Let me give to Pelagia to give some introductions, which we could have done before, but we're skipping the process. So I'll give to Pelagia.
I'm not going to introduce anyone, but we've got people from different organizations which I can see. So maybe they can introduce themselves, their names and their organization, where they come from. I'll start with the GL.
Bring my camera with me. I'm Jill. I work for an organisation